I've played the game of chess since I was young. As I recall, it was around the 6th grade when I learned to play the game. I played it in school and competed in some tournaments. The game's always been of interest to me, and I remember following along as PBS aired coverage of the Fischer-Spassky match way back in 1972. Later in life, as a computer science professor, I took a serious interest in computer chess. I followed news of developments in computer chess and human and computer interactions. Well, enough about me. Let's talk about why I'm posting the videos on chess. I've been approached by several younger folks who have expressed interest in either learning the game or they already know how to play, but they want to improve their play. This is the reason that I'm putting these videos together. I'm compiling a set of instructional videos to help anyone who might be interested in learning the game or improving their play. This first video will focus on the primary equipment used in the game, the chessboard and the chess pieces. In future videos, I'll address topics such as how the pieces move, chess notation and how to keep score, tactics, and much more. So let's get started.
Let's begin with a little background to this game. The exact origin of the game is uncertain. We don't know the name of the person who actually invented the game, nor do we know where it was invented. Some historians say it was invented in China, some say it was in India. We're uncertain. We only know that the game has been around for a long time and it's played around the world. Now, in some countries, chess is considered a sport much like a physical sport such as football or basketball. However, chess is more of an intellectual competition between two players rather than a physical competition. The game actually involves setting goals and making plans. To this end, it involves both strategy and tactics, two topics that we'll discuss in some detail in future videos. Now, to accomplish the tasks of goal setting and plan making, a player must recognize that different pieces have different capabilities, and these pieces must work together as members of a team. There must be some coordination and cooperation between the pieces in order to achieve our ultimate goals. So in some ways, chess can be thought of as a model of life. The pieces of the chessboard are like people in our world which we must interact with. They're all a little different in some way. Now, that being said, let's ask the question, why would we want to learn the game of chess? Why would we want to play chess? Well, although playing the game of chess is fun, there are other benefits to learning and playing the game of chess. And these benefits include improving cognitive skills such as concentration, pattern recognition, decision making, problem solving, and furthermore, they help in developing creativity. Now, because a chess game involves two players and often is played in a chess club or a tournament setting, we see that chess offers a form of social activity. All of this being said, let's add a little bit more into the idea of why we would want to learn to play the game. Well, teaching children chess introduces them to both winning and losing, the idea of sportsmanship. Thus, this helps children see the consequences of their decisions and actions. Furthermore, as we've already indicated, chess helps in developing creativity. And this is because a player must find ways to solve problems presented to them over the chessboard. Perhaps the benefit that I personally find most relevant as I grow older is that chess provides a way to exercise the mind. That is, playing chess or solving chess puzzles or problems helps to keep the mind sharp. Now, with these preliminary comments regarding why play chess, let's turn our attention to how the game is played. And we'll first take a look at the equipment that is needed. So the primary equipment needed to play chess involves a chessboard and chessmen. The board itself consists of 64 squares. What we have is 8 squares going across as a row, which chess players refer to as a rank, and 8 squares from top to bottom as a column. This is referred to as a file. The squares are identified as black and white, although if you examine the figure that I'm presenting here, clearly these colors are not black and white. But by convention, we refer to the squares as black and white, regardless of the actual colors. So there is a light colored square, which we refer to as white, and a dark color square, which we refer to as black. The colors actually alternate in each row or rank and column or file. Now, a common mistake among beginners is the orientation of the chessboard with respect to the players. Take a look at the chessboard as it's presented here. Observe that the square in the lower left corner of the board is a dark colored square. For the opposing player, on the other side, there's a dark colored square on his or her left side. Now, in the right side, there is a light colored square. So an easy way to remember the proper way to position the board is simply remember the phrase white on right. And then we'll have the board in the correct position with respect to the players. The pieces of the game are called chessmen, or simply referred to as men. Now, just as the board consists of black squares and white squares, the pieces are also considered to be black and white. So each player has 16 pieces. Now, the pieces themselves, just like the squares of the board, may not actually be black and white, but we refer to the lighter colored pieces as white and the darker colored pieces as black. Now, each player starts with a king and a queen. This is referred to as the monarchy. See, the chess pieces are symbolic of a medieval army. There are also 2 rooks, the castle, 2 knights, the horsemen, 2 bishops, the church, and 8 pawns, the foot soldiers. So what do the pieces themselves actually look like? Well, we have a way of representing the pieces in diagrams, and we use the graphic symbols as shown in this table. So this table shows the names of the pieces and the symbol that is used to represent that piece in a chess diagram. In addition, we have the notation symbol, which is simply the first character of the name of the piece. When we record the moves of a game, we might indicate, for example, the king, K, moves to some particular square, or the queen, Q, moves to some square, and so on. If you scan the notation symbols, you'll find that the word knight also begins with K. However, we've already assigned K to king. So to avoid potential conflict or confusion, we use the letter N in our notation when we refer to a knight, which isn't so bad because it kind of sounds like knight begins with the letter N. So later on, when we talk about keeping score, we'll use these notation symbols. So the pieces themselves are typically of what's called a Staunton design. So the figure that we have here shows what the white pieces might look like in such a design. The Staunton design is standardized and used in most tournaments. The original design was introduced by Nathaniel Cook in 1849, and the design was named after the British chess champion Howard Staunton, who, by the way, endorsed it. Now, although the figure is showing the white pieces, black has a similar set of pieces. The king is the tallest piece. And notice there's a little crown on top of the king. This helps distinguish it from the queen. Now, the king being the tallest piece says he's very prominent in our army, in our kingdom. Well, in medieval times, the surrender of the king would mean the loss of the kingdom to invading armies, and that could mean change for the worse to anyone within the kingdom. So it was important for everyone in the kingdom, from the lowest serf to the highest ranking official, to keep the king safe from harm. Now, although the king is the most important piece in chess, it is not the most powerful piece. If a player does not protect his or her king, the player will likely lose the game. The chessboard is placed between the two players as shown in this diagram. The player using the white pieces sits on one side of the board, say in the bottom of our diagram here, and the player uses the black pieces sits on the other side, obviously the top of our diagram. As they sit at the board, both players should have a white square in the right corner. Remember the phrase, white on right. If the board has numbers printed on it, as is the case in our diagram here, the numbers should be placed so that 1 is nearest to white and 8 is nearest to black. Remember, 1 through 8 refers to the ranks. If the board has letters, A through H, referring to the files, then we will have A on white's left working alphabetically across to H being on white's right. The numbers and letters are used in recording the game of chess, that is in chess notation. So when we talk about keeping score later, we'll discuss this in more detail. But at the start of the game, the pieces for each player are all grouped on one side of the board. All of the black pieces on one side, all of the white pieces on the other, hence we refer to one side of the board as black side and the other side as white side. So there's no actual separator, even though in my diagram I'm drawing this yellow line across the board to separate the two armies. It's kind of an imaginary horizontal line. But there is something kind of interesting, kind of a fun fact. We said that chess is played in many different countries. In fact, in some countries they have different forms of chess. There's a version of chess played in China called xiangqi, which is elephant chess, xiang being elephant. So in their version of the game, there is not really an imaginary divide between the two sides. There's an actual divide. A river separates the two armies. Kind of interesting. Little piece of trivia. There's another perspective we can take when we look at the board. We've talked about the black's army and white's army. Now we can talk about the pieces relative to the monarchy. There are pieces on one side of the board, kind of lined up near the king, and pieces on the other side of the board lined up near the queen. Hence what we have here is another kind of imaginary divide, talking about the king's side and talking about the queen's side. This is actually more practical when we talk about referring to the individual pieces on the board, because sometimes we'll talk about the king's bishop or the queen's bishop or the king's rook and so on, referring to the piece on the king side or the queen side. Now, we're showing king side as 2 words, queen side as 2 words. It can also be kind of pushed together as a single word. So we can call it king side and queen side. Now, on each side of the imaginary line, there is 1 rook, 1 knight, and 1 bishop. So each side has a king's rook and a queen's rook. That is, black has a king's rook, white has a king's rook, and so on. And likewise for the other pieces. Now, we've used the term rank and file already, but let's elaborate on this now. Although we describe the chessboard as consisting of rows and columns, remember we say that chess players really refer to the rows as ranks and the columns as files. And here we see the ranks kind of numbered for us, 1 through 8, the first rank, the second rank, and so on. Notice that these are numbered from the bottom, which means that the numbering of 1 through 8 is from white's perspective. Even though when you're sitting on the other side playing the black pieces, the rank immediately in front of you might be the first rank in front of you, it is technically the 8th rank because the numbering is done in one perspective, from the perspective of white. So kind of keep that in mind. Now, ranks are numbered 1 through 8. The white pieces are placed on the first rank, and the white pawns are placed on the second rank. Similarly, the black pieces are placed on the 8th rank, and the black pawns on the 7th rank. So at the start of the game, what we have is that additional row of pawns in front of the pieces on either side. Now, as we look at the files are labeled with letters A through H. So each column is a file, and the files labeled A through D describe the queen side of the board. The D file is where the queen is actually positioned when we start the game. So that's called the queen's file. And files labeled E through H are on the king's side, and the file labeled E is where the king starts the game, so that's also called the king's file. Now let's talk about the placement of the pieces on the board. Remember that each army has 2 rooks. So what we see is the rooks are placed on the corners of the board as shown here. So white has a rook on A1, the A file, rank 1, and on H1, the H file, rank 1. And likewise, black has a rook on A8 and H8. What's interesting is each side has a rook that starts the game on a black square, and their other rook starts the game on a white square. Okay, just kind of an observation. Keep that in mind because we're going to talk about a couple variations on colors in just a moment. So one rook is called the queen's rook. Not surprisingly, that's the one on the A file closer to the queen, and the other rook is called the king's rook on the H file closer to the king. The knights. The knights are placed right next to the rooks. So we have the white knights are situated on squares B1 and G1, and the black knights are on B8 and G8. So what we have is a queen's knight, and we have a king's knight. So when we discuss how the pieces move, we'll see that the knight is a very unique piece because it's affected by the color of the square on which it is placed. Now, we had mentioned that the rooks start the game one rook on white, one rook on a black square. Likewise, the knights start on white square and black square. But the way the knight moves is quite unique. When the knight is moved, it always moves to a square of a different color than the square it's currently located on. So, for example, the queen's knight here for white, which is located on a white square on B1, will move to a black square on its next move, and then to a white square on its next move following that, and so on. We'll discuss the details of how it moves a little bit later in another video. This is a behavior that's very unique to the knight, so kind of keep that in mind. Now, kind of just a thought is because the knight is always changing color or color of the square, maybe a better name for the knight might have been something like chameleon because it's changing color. Just a little thought. I don't think anyone's going to go with that. Just try to inject a little humor here. Okay, let's move on. Next we have the bishops. Each player again has two bishops, and these are positioned next to the knights. The bishop starts on a black square, and the other bishop starts on a white square. So what we have is a queen's bishop placed next to the queen on the C file, and a king's bishop placed next to the king on the F file. Now, when we discuss how the pieces move, we'll see that the bishop is also a special piece because it is also affected by the color of the square that it starts on. Whereas the knight is always changing the color, the bishop will always stay on the same color. So what this means is we have one bishop that starts on a black square, and for the entire length of its play in the game, it will remain on black squares. And the other bishop starts on white squares and remains on white squares for the entire game. Now, simple little quiz. On what color square is white's queen bishop in the starting position? Well, the queen bishop is located on C1, so it's on a black square. Now, on what color square is black's queen bishop in the starting position? Well, black's queen bishop is located on C8. That's a white square. That seems like a very simple quiz, very insignificant, but actually the answers to these questions, very important. If a bishop starts on a black square, the bishop is restricted to black squares for the entire game. And likewise, starting on a white square, it's restricted to white squares. Very unique behavior, characteristic only of the bishop. And we'll talk more about that when we talk about the movement of the pieces down the road. Now, the queen. Well, each player has exactly one queen. And the queen is always placed on a square that is the same color as the queen. So the white queen starts the game on a white square, in this case D1, as we see on our board diagram. And the black queen starts on a black square, D8. So the queen always starts the game on a square of the same color as the queen, white or black. That's important kind of in remembering how to set up the pieces. So the queens again are positioned on the D file at the start of the game. What about the king? Well, each player has exactly one king. The king is always placed on a square that is the opposite color of the king. So here we have the white king starts on a black square. The black king starts on a white square. So the white king starts on E1 and the black king starts on e8. So the kings start on the E file. The king and queen are always right next to one another in the initial starting position. So as we set up the pieces, we've looked at each individual piece. Let's put them together and also throw the pawns on the board. And what we see is the complete initial starting position. And the pawns, what we have is a row of pawns is presented in front of the chess pieces for white and in front of the chess pieces for black. Now again, the chessboard is positioned between the two players, and again remember that the white on right rule. So for the H1 square for white is a white square on the player's right side. And that's how the board is set up, pieces are set up, and where the players will actually sit with respect to the board. Okay, we've talked about the pawns being added, and now we're actually ready to start the game. Of course, we don't know much about moving the pieces at this point, but at least we can set up the board properly. So let's recap what we've talked about in this video. We covered a variety of topics. One was the benefits of playing chess. We talked about the chess equipment, the board and pieces, discussing the layout of the chessboard, including the proper orientation, discussed terms like ranks and files, and we talked about the placement of the pieces on the chessboard. Next time, we're going to talk about how the pieces move, and we'll start introducing the pieces, giving you an idea of actually how to play the game. So in our next video, we'll continue and look at the movement of the pieces.